Introduction: Agency Disclosure in Modern Arizona, Real Estate Practice. In the previous section, we explored the regulatory framework governing real estate professionals in Arizona and the role of the Arizona Department of Real Estate in enforcing compliance with statutory and administrative requirements. Regulation ensures that real estate professionals operate within a structured system designed to protect consumers and maintain professional standards across the industry. One of the most important consumer protection tools within that framework is agency disclosure. Agency disclosure informs consumers about who the real estate professional represents in a transaction and what duties the professional owes to each party. Without this transparency, buyers and sellers may mistakenly assume that an agent represents them when the agent actually represents the other party in the transaction. Arizona law addresses this issue through ARS Par 32-2156, which requires licensees to disclose their agency relationships before entering into substantive discussions about a real estate transaction. This disclosure ensures that consumers understand the nature of the relationship they have with a real estate professional and allows them to make informed decisions about representation. In the Phoenix metropolitan real estate market, where buyers often encounter listing agents at open houses or through online inquiries, agency disclosure is particularly important. By clearly explaining representation at the beginning of a professional relationship, agents can prevent misunderstandings and ensure that agency duties are properly defined. A. Legal purpose of the disclosure, not an employment agreement. The real estate agency disclosure and election form serves an important informational purpose, but it is often misunderstood by consumers and new licensees. The disclosure form is designed to explain agency relationships and allow consumers to select the type of representation they prefer. It is not an employment agreement or representation contract. Instead, it is a document that helps the consumer understand the available options for representation in a real estate transaction. For example, a buyer attending an open house in Chandler may meet a listing agent for the first time. Before discussing the buyer's financial situation or negotiating strategies, the agent should explain the available agency relationships using the agency disclosure form. The buyer may choose to work with their own buyer's agent, proceed without representation, or consent to limited representation under certain circumstances. The disclosure ensures that the consumer understands these options before any substantive discussions occur. Clarifying the purpose of the disclosure form helps prevent confusion about whether an agency relationship has actually been created. B. Mandatory disclosure, before substantive discussion. Arizona law requires that agency disclosure occur before substantive discussions begin. Substantive discussions include conversations about pricing strategies, negotiation tactics, financing details, or other information that could influence the outcome of a transaction. This requirement ensures that consumers understand who the agent represents before sharing confidential information. For example, if a buyer contacts a listing agent in Scottsdale after seeing a property advertised online, the listing agent must explain that they represent the seller before discussing the buyer's offer strategy or financial qualifications. If the buyer mistakenly believes that the listing agent represents them, the buyer may share confidential information that could weaken their negotiating position. By providing agency disclosure early in the conversation, the agent helps the consumer understand the relationship and protects both parties from misunderstandings. Early disclosure also helps prevent claims of unintentional dual agency or misrepresentation. C. Buyer's broker representation and fiduciary duties. When a buyer chooses to work with a buyer's broker, the broker owes fiduciary duties to the buyer. These duties include loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting, as discussed earlier in Chapter 4. Buyer representation allows the buyer to receive professional guidance throughout the property search and negotiation process. In the Phoenix housing market, buyer's agents often assist clients in evaluating comparable sales, identifying suitable properties, and negotiating favorable contract terms. For example, a buyer searching for homes in Mesa may rely on their buyer's agent to analyze recent sales in the neighborhood to determine an appropriate offer price. Because the buyer's agent owes fiduciary duties to the buyer, the agent must protect the buyer's interests and maintain confidentiality regarding the buyer's financial limits and negotiation strategy. Buyer representation provides consumers with professional advocacy and helps ensure that their interests are protected throughout the transaction. D. Seller's broker representation and fiduciary duties. Seller representation creates a fiduciary relationship between the listing broker and the seller. The listing broker is responsible for marketing the property, advising the seller on pricing strategies, and negotiating offers from prospective buyers. In the Phoenix metropolitan market, where multiple offers are common in desirable neighborhoods, the listing broker plays an important role in helping the seller evaluate competing offers and select the most advantageous contract. For example, a seller in Gilbert may receive several offers with different price points, financing terms, and closing timelines. The listing agent must present all offers to the seller and provide professional guidance while allowing the seller to make the final decision. Because the listing agent owes fiduciary duties to the seller, the agent must protect confidential information about the seller's motivations and negotiating strategy. Seller representation ensures that the seller receives professional advice designed to maximize the outcome of the transaction. E. Limited representation. Broker representing both parties. Limited representation occurs when the same brokerage represents both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. This situation is commonly referred to as dual agency. In Arizona, limited representation is permitted only when both parties provide informed written consent. When a brokerage represents both parties, the broker and agents must remain neutral and cannot advocate exclusively for either side. This limitation means that the broker cannot advise one party on how to gain an advantage over the other party during negotiations. For example, if a buyer represented by the same brokerage submits an offer on a property listed by the brokerage in Tempe, both parties must be informed that the brokerage represents both sides. Once consent is obtained, the brokerage can facilitate the transaction, but must avoid sharing confidential information or providing strategic negotiation advice that favors one party over the other. Limited representation requires careful communication and documentation to ensure compliance with Arizona law. F. Statutory disclosure exemptions under ARS. Paragraph 32(2)(156). While agency disclosure is generally required before substantive discussions occur, Arizona law recognizes limited circumstances in which disclosure requirements may not apply. ARS Paragraph 32(156) provides exemptions for certain activities that do not involve substantive real estate discussions. For example, licensees may provide general real estate information at public events, educational seminars, or marketing presentations without immediately creating an agency relationship. These exemptions allow real estate professionals to engage in general marketing and consumer education without triggering formal disclosure requirements. However, once a conversation shifts from general information to specific advice about a transaction, the agent must provide agency disclosure before continuing the discussion. Understanding these exemptions helps agents distinguish between casual conversations and professional interactions that require formal disclosure. G. Separation of agency and compensation. One of the most common misconceptions among consumers is the belief that the agent who receives compensation automatically represents the client. In reality, agency relationships and compensation arrangements are separate legal concepts. Agency determines who the agent represents and what fiduciary duties the agent owes, while compensation determines how the brokerage is paid for services. For example, in many Arizona residential transactions, the seller pays a commission that is shared between the listing brokerage and the cooperating buyer's brokerage. Even though the buyer's agent is compensated through the listing brokerage's commission, the buyer's agent still represents the buyer and owes fiduciary duties to the buyer. Understanding this separation helps consumers recognize that compensation structures do not determine agency relationships. Agents should clearly explain this distinction when discussing representation with clients so that clients fully understand the professional relationship. Discussion questions. Why does Arizona law require agency disclosure before substantive discussions occur? Answer. To ensure that consumers understand who the agent represents before sharing confidential information. Why is the real estate agency disclosure and election form not considered an employment agreement? Answer. Because it explains representation options rather than creating a formal brokerage employment relationship. Why must agency relationships be separated from compensation discussions? Answer. Because agency determines representation duties, while compensation determines how the brokerage is paid.